What happens when a man sworn to uphold the law breaks it in the one place it's supposed to be most sacred? A crowded courtroom. A decorated police officer, a terrified teenager, and a single ringing slap that echoes in the stunned silence. For Officer Frank Miller, it was a moment of dominance, putting a young punk in his place. He thought it was over. He didn't count on the one thing that would unravel his entire life. He didn't count on the courtroom doors swinging open and the boy's father walking in. A father who wasn't a lawyer or a preacher or a politician. He was a senior special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And he had just witnessed the biggest mistake of Officer Miller's life. The air in Courtroom 4B of the Clarence M. Mitchell Jr. Courthouse in Baltimore was thick with the familiar cocktail of cheap disinfectant stale coffee and quiet desperation. It was the misdemeanor mill, a place where lives were altered not with the bang of a dramatic trial, but with the monotonous thud of a judge's gavel. 17-year-old Timothy Hayes sat hunched next to his overworked public defender, Sarah Chen. He wasn't a criminal, not really. He was a kid with a passion that had been misinterpreted as a crime. His world was viewed through the lens of a Canon EOS 90D, a cherished gift from his father. Timothy saw art in the urban decay of his West Baltimore neighborhood, the way sunlight caught the rust on a fire escape, the defiant bloom of a weed through a crack in the pavement, the intricate layered graffiti on the brick walls of abandoned warehouses. That was where he'd been arrested. Not tagging, not destroying property, but photographing it. He had been setting up a long exposure shot of a mural by a local artist, a piece that celebrated the city's history. To get the perfect angle, he'd used a small temporary stencil and a can of chalk spray, the kind that washes away with the first rain, to create a foreground element, a silhouette of a raven. That's when the patrol car had screeched to a halt. Officer Frank Miller had emerged from the car, like a bull entering a china shop. Miller was a cop of the old school, a man with 15 years on the force and a jaw that looked like it had been chiseled from granite. He saw the world in stark black and white, cops and robbers, order and chaos. And to him, a black kid with a spray can in a derelict part of town was a problem to be solved, not a person to be understood. "What do you think you're doing, punk?" Miller's voice had been a low growl. "It's chalk spray, sir." Timothy had tried to explain, his voice trembling slightly. "For a photo. It's an art project." Miller had sneered, kicking over Timothy's tripod. "Art project, you're defacing property. You think you're Banksy? You're just another thug." Timothy's protestations were ignored. The expensive camera was roughly shoved into an evidence bag, the chalk can tossed into the trunk, and Timothy was cuffed so tightly the metal bit into his wrists. The charge was vandalism and resisting arrest, the latter tacked on when Timothy flinched in pain as his arm was twisted behind his back. Now, sitting in the courtroom, Timothy felt a knot of dread in his stomach. His dad, Stephen, was supposed to be here. He was flying in from a work trip in Quantico. "Just stay calm, Timothy. Tell the truth. I'll be there as soon as I land," he'd said over the phone last night. But his flight had been delayed. Sarah Chen patted his hand. "Don't worry, Timothy. The prosecutor's offer is 6 months probation and community service. It's not fair, but it's better than fighting it and losing. The judge is having a bad day." Timothy's heart sank. Probation. A record. All for a photograph he never even got to take. Across the room, Officer Frank Miller stood near the prosecution's table, arms crossed over his broad chest. He wore his dress blues, a row of service ribbons, pinned neatly above his badge. He caught Timothy's eye and offered a smirk, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. Miller lived for these moments. They reaffirmed his worldview. He was the shepherd, and kids like Timothy were the lost sheep needing a firm hand to be guided back to the flock whether they liked it or not. He had a reputation in the precinct as a cop's cop, a guy who made good arrests and didn't shy away from confrontation. His personnel file told a slightly different story, one with a string of civilian complaints about excessive force, all of them deemed unsubstantiated by an internal review board stacked with his friends. "All rise," the bailiff droned. Judge Elizabeth Reynolds, a stern woman in her late 50s, swept into the room and took her seat. She looked exhausted, peering over her glasses at the docket. Case 734, B City of Baltimore versus Timothy Hayes. Vandalism resisting arrest. Ms. Chen. "How does your client plead?" Sarah Chen stood. "Your Honor, we have accepted the prosecution's offer. My client will plead no contest in exchange for probation and—" Timothy couldn't help himself. The injustice of it all bubbled up inside him. He wasn't a thug. He was a good student. He'd never been in trouble. His dad had raised him to respect the law, to be better. This wasn't right. "It's a lie," Timothy whispered, just loud enough for the court stenographer and Officer Miller to hear. "I didn't do anything." Miller's head snapped toward him. His eyes, which were a pale, cold blue, narrowed into slits. Judge Reynolds looked up, her expression hardening. "What was that, Mr. Hayes?" "Nothing, Your Honor," Sarah said, quickly pressing a warning hand on Timothy's shoulder. But Miller saw his chance. This was a challenge to his authority right here in the temple of law and order. He took 2 steps forward, closing the distance between himself and the defense table. "The defendant is showing contempt, Your Honor," Miller said, his voice booming in the quiet room. "He's a disrespectful punk who has no regard for the law inside or outside this courtroom." "That's enough, officer," the judge warned, her voice laced with ice. But Miller was already in Timothy's space, leaning over him, his shadow falling across the table. "You got something to say, boy? Say it, so the whole room can hear." Timothy, terrified and cornered, shrank back in his chair. He looked at Miller's smug, reddening face and felt a surge of defiant anger. "You're the one who's lying," he muttered, his voice cracking. "You just wanted to bust someone." It happened in a blink. Miller's hand, a slab of thick-fingered meat, whipped through the air. The sound was sharp and sickening, a crack that wasn't a gavel. It was the sound of an open palm connecting with a teenager's cheek. Gasps filled the courtroom. Sarah Chen cried out, "Your Honor!" The prosecutor's jaw went slack. The bailiff instinctively reached for his sidearm, then stopped, utterly bewildered. Timothy's head snapped to the side, a bright red handprint already blooming on his dark skin. Tears of shock and humiliation sprang to his eyes. He hadn't just been arrested. He hadn't just been accused. He had been assaulted by a police officer in a courtroom in front of a judge. Officer Frank Miller stood upright, his chest puffed out, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. He had restored order. He had asserted his dominance. He felt powerful, untouchable. Judge Reynolds was on her feet, her face a mask of pure fury. "Officer Miller, you are in—" She never finished the sentence, because at that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a soft whoosh. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that spoke of federal authority, not local law enforcement. He radiated a calm, controlled energy that was the polar opposite of the chaotic scene inside. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the room, taking in every detail. In a fraction of a second, the shocked faces, the furious Judge Officer Miller standing over the defense table, and the boy, his son, cradling his face. He took a step forward, his polished leather shoes making no sound on the worn linoleum. His voice when he spoke was not loud, but it cut through the stunned silence like a surgeon's scalpel. "Officer," he said, his tone dangerously level, "take your hand off my son." Frank Miller turned, an arrogant retort ready on his lips. "And who the hell are you?" The man walked slowly down the center aisle, his gaze locked on Miller. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather credential case, flipping it open. The golden letters gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "Special Agent Stephen Hayes," he said, his voice like ice. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, and you and I are going to have a very long conversation." Frank Miller's face went from flushed red to sheet white. The smirk, the arrogance, the look of triumph, it all vanished, replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. He had not just slapped some random street kid. He had assaulted the son of an FBI agent, and his life as he knew it was over. The silence in Courtroom 4B was no longer just stunned. It was electric. The established hierarchy of the room judge, prosecutor, police defendant had been shattered and reassembled in the span of 10 seconds. Frank Miller, who moments before had been the embodiment of state power, now looked like a man who had accidentally kicked a hornet's nest the size of a minivan. Special Agent Stephen Hayes didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a declaration of war. He stopped beside the defense table, placing a reassuring hand on Timothy's shoulder, while his eyes remained fixed on Miller, boring into him with the intensity of a laser sight. "Dad," Timothy whispered, a mixture of relief and anguish in his voice. Stephen squeezed his son's shoulder gently. "I'm here, son. It's okay." He then turned his full attention back to the suddenly petrified police officer. Judge Reynolds, recovering from her initial shock, found her voice. It was shaking with rage. "Bailiff, take Officer Miller into custody. He is in contempt of this court. Gross contempt." The bailiff, a portly man named Johnson, who had seen it all, finally moved. He approached Miller cautiously, as one might approach a wounded bear. "Frank, you heard the judge. Let's go." Miller was frozen, his mind racing. This couldn't be happening. An FBI agent. Here, he tried to regain his composure, to fall back on the bluster that had served him so well for 15 years. "Now hold on," he stammered, looking from the judge to Stephen Hayes. "The kid was being disruptive. He provoked." Stephen Hayes took another step forward, closing the distance until he was less than 2 feet from Miller. He was leaner than the burly cop, but he carried himself with an unshakable confidence that made him seem 10 feet tall. "Provoked you?" Stephen's voice was a low, menacing whisper. "My son, a 17-year-old boy, provoked a decorated officer of the Baltimore Police Department into committing battery in a court of law. Is that going to be your official statement?" "Officer Miller, because I assure you every word you say from this moment on will be scrutinized by my office and the Department of Justice." The mention of the DOJ sent a fresh wave of panic across Miller's face. This was escalating beyond a simple complaint. This was federal. I was maintaining order," Miller sputtered, his defense sounding feeble even to his own ears. "You call that order?" Stephen gestured with his chin toward Timothy's reddened cheek. "That looks like a felony assault to me. Assault under color of law. That's a federal crime, officer. U.S. Code, Title 18, Section 242. Carries a penalty of up to 10 years in prison. I'm sure a man of your experience is familiar with it." Miller swallowed hard. He was. He just never thought it would apply to him. The bailiff finally put a hand on Miller's arm. "Frank, come on. Don't make this worse." This time, Miller complied, allowing himself to be led toward a holding cell behind the judge's bench. His eyes darted around the room looking for an ally, but found only condemnation. His partner, a rookie named Evans who was observing from the gallery, stared at the floor, wanting to be anywhere else. The prosecutor looked horrified at the potential fallout for her case. Sarah Chen looked at Stephen Hayes with a newfound sense of hope for her client. As Miller was led away, he cast one last desperate look at Stephen Hayes. It was a look that pleaded for an off-ramp, a way to de-escalate a professional courtesy. He found none. Stephen's face was a mask of cold, professional fury. The hunter had found his prey. With Miller gone, the tension in the room lessened, but the gravity of the situation remained. Judge Reynolds sank back into her chair, pressing her fingers to her temples. "Agent Hayes," she began, her voice weary. I am appalled. I have never in 20 years on the bench seen such a disgusting abuse of authority in my courtroom." "I appreciate that, Your Honor," Stephen said calmly. He turned to Sarah Chen. "Ma'am, I'm Stephen Hayes, Timothy's father." Sarah shook his hand, still slightly dazed. "Sarah Chen, public defender. Mr. Hayes, I am so sorry. You have nothing to apologize for," Stephen interrupted gently. "You were doing your job. Now, if I may, Your Honor," he said, addressing the judge again. "Given the circumstances, I request that all charges against my son, Timothy Hayes, be dismissed with prejudice." The prosecutor, a young man named Peterson, finally spoke up. "Your Honor, the state. We'd be willing to drop the resisting arrest charge, but the vandalism—" Stephen turned his head slowly to face Peterson. "The vandalism charge, the one predicated on the testimony of the officer who just assaulted a juvenile defendant in front of a half-dozen witnesses, the officer whose credibility is now, shall we say, compromised. You really want to proceed with that? Mr. Peterson?" Peterson paled. He looked at the judge, who was glaring at him, as if he'd just suggested setting the courthouse on fire. "I think," Judge Reynolds said, her voice dripping with acid, "that Agent Hayes makes an excellent point. The integrity of the state's case has been irrevocably damaged. All charges against Mr. Timothy Hayes are hereby dismissed, with prejudice. His record is to be expunged. Ms. Chen, please see the clerk to get the paperwork started." She slammed the gavel down. "This court is in recess." She stood and swept out of the room without a backward glance. The courtroom began to empty, people chattering in hushed, excited tones about what they had just witnessed. Timothy finally let out a shaky breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The weight that had been crushing him for weeks had vanished. He was free. He stood up and hugged his father tightly. "You came," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I told you I would," Stephen said, holding his son close. He gently tilted Timothy's chin up, examining the red mark on his face. The cold fury returned to his eyes. "We'll get some ice on that. But this isn't over, not by a long shot." As they walked out of the courtroom, Sarah Chen caught up to them. "Agent Hayes," she said. "Thank you. I've seen Miller operate for years. He's a bully. No one's ever been able to touch him." Bullies only have power when people are afraid, Stephen replied, his gaze distant. He just picked on the wrong family. He guided Timothy down the marble hallway, his arm firmly around his son's shoulders. To Timothy, his father was a savior. But Stephen Hayes knew this was just the beginning. Holding one cop in contempt for a few hours was not justice. Justice was systemic. It was thorough. And it was unforgiving. Frank Miller thought his worst problem was a night in a holding cell and a dressing down from the judge. He had no idea that Special Agent Stephen Hayes of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit was about to launch an investigation that would not just end his career, but peel back a layer of rot within the Baltimore Police Department that would shake the city to its core. The slap was not the main event. It was the starting pistol. The drive from the courthouse to their quiet row house in Federal Hill was silent. Stephen focused on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Timothy stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of his city go by. They felt different now, tinged with the memory of his humiliation. The red mark on his cheek had subsided to a dull, angry flush, but the internal sting remained. Once inside, Stephen led Timothy to the kitchen and wrapped a bag of frozen peas in a dish towel, gently pressing it against his son's face. "Does it hurt?" Stephen asked, his voice softer now. "Not really," Timothy lied. I can't believe that happened." Stephen's jaw tightened. "Believe it. There are men like Miller everywhere. Men who mistake their badge for a crown and their authority for divinity. They count on people being too scared or too tired to fight back." "He looked scared when you showed him your badge," Timothy said, a flicker of satisfaction in his voice. "Fear is a temporary motivator, Timothy. I'm not interested in making him scared. I'm interested in making him accountable." Stephen's phone buzzed. It was his partner, Special Agent Mark Riley. "Dave, I heard. The whole Baltimore field office is buzzing. You okay? How's the kid?" "We're fine, Mark. The kid's tough," Stephen said, glancing at Timothy. "But I'm not fine with what happened. I'm opening a preliminary inquiry. Assault under color of law. I want you to pull everything we have on a BPD officer named Frank Miller. Personnel file commendations, and especially any sealed or unsubstantiated complaints. I want to know every stop he's made in the last year, every arrest, every partner he's had." "You got it," Mark replied. "They're gonna stonewall us, you know. The BPD circles the wagons tight." "Let them," Stephen said, a cold edge to his voice. "I've got a searchlight, and I'm about to shine it into every dark corner they've got. Start with his financials. A guy with that much arrogance is usually hiding something." He hung up and looked at Timothy. "I need you to tell me everything that happened, from the very beginning. Don't leave out a single detail, no matter how small you think it is." For the next hour, Timothy recounted the story. He talked about his passion for photography, the specific mural he was shooting, the chalk spray, the sudden arrival of Miller's patrol car. He described Miller's immediate aggression, the way he'd kicked the tripod, the words he'd used. "He took my camera," Timothy said. "It's in evidence lockup." Stephen's eyes narrowed. "He took your camera? Why standard procedure would be to photograph the vandalism and maybe confiscate the spray can. Taking the camera itself is aggressive. Overkill. He said it was part of the instrumentalities of the crime," Timothy recalled. "That's a stretch even for a creative prosecutor," Stephen mused. "He really wanted that camera." He filed the detail away. It felt important, though. He wasn't sure why, yet. The next morning, Stephen Hayes walked into the FBI's Baltimore field office on Lord Baltimore Drive, not as a father, but as the seasoned investigator he was. He was a specialist in public corruption, a man who had spent his career untangling complex webs of bribery, extortion, and official misconduct. He knew how dirty cops thought how they covered their tracks and where they hid their secrets. Mark Riley was waiting for him in his office, a stack of files on his desk. Morning. The BPD's Internal Affairs Department sends its deepest regrets and is launching its own thorough investigation, Mark said, making air quotes. They'll give Miller a slap on the wrist, maybe some mandatory anger management, and quietly transfer him to a desk job for a year. That's what they think, Stephen said, taking a file. What did you find? Miller's a piece of work, Mark began. 15 years on the force, 2 commendations for bravery, both involving shootouts. But look at this. He pointed to a list. 7 excessive force complaints in the last 10 years. A woman whose arm was broken during a public intoxication arrest. A suspect who fell down the stairs at the precinct. A kid who claimed Miller bashed his head against a patrol car. All of them investigated by IAD. All of them ruled unsubstantiated. Key witnesses suddenly couldn't be found. Victims decided not to cooperate. He's being protected, Stephen stated. It was a classic pattern. A problem officer, who was good at making arrests, was often insulated by his superiors and the police union. Protected is an understatement. His direct superior is a lieutenant named Kowski. They came up through the ranks together. Kowski signs off on all of Miller's reports and has personally testified to his character in 2 of the complaint hearings. So Kowski's the shepherd, Stephen said. Let's look at the finances. Mark slid another file across the desk. This is where it gets interesting. Miller's salary is about $85,000 a year. His wife is a part-time nurse. They've got 2 kids in private school, a mortgage on a house in pricey Ruxton, and 2 new SUVs. It's tight, but maybe doable. But, Stephen prompted. But he also has a boat, Mark said, grinning. A 32-foot Sea Ray, docked at the inner harbour. Paid for last year. In cash. Stephen leaned back in his chair. This was it. The loose thread. The telltale sign of illicit income. A cop on a city salary doesn't buy a boat with a paper bag full of $100 bills. That's our way in, Stephen said. A boat bought with what is probable cause for a deep dive into his finances. He's not just a bully. He's dirty. The question is, how is he getting the money? The answer he suspected might be hidden on the memory card of his son's camera. I'm going to get that camera back, Stephen said, standing up. It's evidence in a case that's been dismissed. There's no legal reason for them to hold it. He drove to the BPD's Central Evidence Warehouse, a grim, windowless building downtown. He presented the court order for dismissal and the property voucher for Timothy's camera. The clerk, a weary man, who looked like he'd been born behind the counter, grumbled but eventually went to retrieve the items. He returned with the evidence bag containing the Canon camera. As Stephen signed the release form, the clerk said, "You're lucky. Officer Miller was just here yesterday, asking about this." Stephen froze. He was why? Dunno. The clerk shrugged. Said something about needing to get the pictures off it for his final report. Told him he needed a warrant or a prosecutor's request. Seemed real agitated about it. Stephen's mind went into overdrive. Agitated. Miller wasn't just trying to cover his bases for a report. He was desperate to see what was on that camera. The initial arrest wasn't a random act of a power-tripping cop. It was targeted. Miller wanted the camera for a reason. He rushed home, his heart pounding with the thrill of the chase. He found Timothy in his room sketching in a notebook. They released it, Stephen said, placing the camera on the desk. Timothy's face lit up. He carefully took the camera out, handling it like a sacred object. The memory card should still be in there. He popped the SD card into his laptop. Probably nothing on it from that night, Timothy said glumly. He arrested me before I could take the main shot. Just a few test exposures to check the light. He clicked through a few blurry, underexposed images. Then he stopped on one. It was a wide shot of the alley, slightly out of focus, taken a few minutes before Miller had arrived. The main subject, the wall was dark, but in the background, down the alley near the street, the ambient light from a street lamp illuminated a brief scene. "What's that?" Stephen said, leaning closer. The image was grainy, but digital enhancement could work wonders. Two figures were visible. One was a man in a hooded sweatshirt, his back mostly to the camera. The other was a man in profile. A big, burly man with a familiar granite jawline. It was Frank Miller, out of his uniform. The man in the sweatshirt was passing an envelope to Miller. Timothy zoomed in. The image became pixelated, but the action was undeniable. It was a handoff, a clandestine meeting in an alley. "Dad?" Timothy said, his voice barely a whisper. "Is that?" Stephen Hayes stared at the screen, a grim smile touching his lips. He finally understood. Timothy hadn't just stumbled into an angry cop's path. He had inadvertently photographed a crime in progress. The vandalism charge, the aggressive arrest, the confiscation of the camera, it was all a desperate attempt by Frank Miller to find and destroy the single piece of evidence that could expose him. "That son," Stephen said, his voice filled with cold certainty, "is our smoking gun, and Officer Miller just handed it to us." The photograph on Timothy's SD card changed everything. The investigation pivoted from a simple case of assault under color of law to a full-blown public corruption probe. The blurry image of Officer Frank Miller accepting an envelope in a darkened alley was the key that would unlock a door the BPD had kept bolted shut for years. In a secure conference room at the FBI field office, Stephen Hayes and Mark Riley projected the enhanced image onto a large screen. The FBI's forensic imaging unit had worked wonders clarifying the figures and the setting. "We ran facial recognition on the other guy," Mark said, pointing to the man in the hoodie. "No hits in our databases, but we circulated a filtered image to a few trusted CIs. "And," Stephen prompted. "And we got a hit," Mark said with satisfaction. "His name is Dominic Donny Petrino, a low-level enforcer and bagman for the Rinaldi crime family. They control a lot of the illegal gambling and loan sharking operations in East Baltimore." Stephen stared at the screen, connecting the dots. "So Miller isn't just shaking down street-level dealers for pocket money. He's on the payroll of organized crime." "Looks like it," Mark confirmed. "The Rinaldis pay for protection. They get tipped off about raids, have rival operations disrupted, and get their own people a get-out-of-jail-free card when they get pinched. Miller is their point man inside the department." This was bigger than Stephen had imagined. The boat wasn't paid for with extortion money from a few local businesses. It was funded by a sophisticated criminal enterprise, and a man like Miller wouldn't be acting alone. "He needs cover," Stephen reasoned, pacing the room. "Someone to make his cases disappear, to bury complaints, to make sure he's assigned to the right places at the right times. Someone like his mentor and supervisor, Lieutenant Kowski." The next step was to get a warrant. Not just any warrant, but a sneak and peek warrant for Miller's financial records, phone records, and GPS data from his personal vehicle and his patrol car. With the photograph and the identification of Donny Petrino, they had more than enough probable cause. A federal judge signed off on it within hours. The data began to pour in, and Stephen's team of analysts started to weave it all together into a tapestry of corruption. Miller's phone records were a gold mine. He had a burner phone, but he wasn't as smart as he thought. He had used it to call his wife once, just once, which was enough for them to link it to him. That burner phone communicated almost daily with another burner, which they quickly traced to Donnie Petrino. But it also communicated with a third number. "Got him," Mark said, walking into Stephen's office. "The third burner belongs to Lieutenant Adam Kowski. Miller and his boss are talking on disposable phones. It doesn't get much more suspicious than that." The GPS data was even more damning. It showed Miller's patrol car frequently parked for long stretches in areas far outside his designated patrol zone, often near businesses known to be fronts for the Rinaldi family. His personal car's GPS showed multiple late-night trips to quiet, secluded spots, marinas, industrial parks, the very alley where Timothy had taken his photo, correlating perfectly with the times of his burner phone calls to Petrino. The financial records told the final part of the story. Miller and Kowski had a system. Miller would collect the cash from Petrino. He would then deposit small amounts, always under the $10,000 federal reporting threshold, into various bank accounts in his wife's and parents' names. This is known as structuring a federal crime in itself. Kowski was smarter. He wasn't depositing cash. Instead, his elderly mother, living in a retirement home on a fixed income, had somehow won the lottery. Twice. Small local lotteries for amounts like $50,000 and $75,000. "The Rinaldis are laundering the money for him," Stephen concluded. "They're buying winning lottery tickets from the actual winners for a premium, then giving the tickets to Kowski's mother to cash in. It makes the dirty money look clean." They had a rock-solid case for extortion, money laundering, and conspiracy. But Stephen wanted more. He didn't just want to put Miller and Kowski in jail. He wanted to send a message. He wanted to catch them in the act. "It's time to rattle the cage," Stephen announced to his team. His first move was formal. He, along with an attorney from the U.S. Attorney's Office, scheduled a meeting with the BPD Commissioner and the head of Internal Affairs. In a sterile, high-level meeting, Stephen laid out the undeniable evidence of the assault in the courtroom. He made it clear the FBI was pursuing federal charges against Miller. He deliberately omitted any mention of the corruption investigation. The effect was exactly as he'd predicted. The BPD, trying to contain the damage, immediately suspended Officer Frank Miller, without pay, pending the outcome of the federal investigation. The news hit Miller like a freight train. He was a cop. It was all he was. Without the badge and the gun, he was just a guy with a mortgage he couldn't afford and a boat he couldn't use. The pressure started to build. His pay was cut off. The Rinaldis, spooked by the federal heat, told their man Petrino to lay low. Miller's illicit income stream dried up overnight. Stephen's team listened via their wiretap as Miller made a series of panicked calls to Kowski on their burner phones. "They suspended me, Adam." Miller's voice was tight with fear. "The feds are all over this slap thing. That Agent Hayes, he's out for blood." "Calm down, Frank." Kowski's voice was steady but strained. "It's just for show. They'll investigate, find you overreacted, and that'll be the end of it. Just lay low. Do not under any circumstances contact Petrino." But as the weeks went by, the pressure intensified. The bank sent a warning about his mortgage. His wife was asking questions he couldn't answer. Frank Miller began to unravel. He started drinking heavily. His paranoia grew. He was certain he was being watched, and he was right. FBI surveillance teams followed him on his trips to the liquor store and back. Stephen knew it was time for the next step to turn one of them, and Donnie Petrino, the bagman, was the weakest link. 2 FBI agents, including Mark Riley, picked up Petrino on a minor parole violation. They didn't take him to jail. They took him to a quiet, neutral location, a hotel room. Stephen Hayes was waiting for them. He didn't threaten or yell. He simply laid out the facts. "Donnie, we have you on surveillance video meeting with Officer Miller. We have phone records. We have financial trails. The Rinaldi family is already cutting you loose. They see you as a liability." He slid a file across the table. It was filled with photographs. Photos of Petrino meeting with Miller. Photos of Petrino's own family, his wife picking up their daughter from school. The message was clear. "We know everything." "Right now," Stephen continued, "you're looking at 10 to 15 years for your role in a conspiracy to bribe a public official. Or, you can help yourself. You can help us." Petrino, a man who operated on a code of street loyalty, looked at the photo of his daughter and saw that code evaporate. "What do you want me to do?" he mumbled. "We want you to make one more delivery to Miller," Stephen said, "and you're going to be wearing a wire." The plan was set. Petrino would call Miller telling him he had his severance package from the family, one last big payment to keep him quiet. He'd tell him to meet at the old spot, the alley where it all began. Miller, desperate for cash and feeling abandoned, would be unable to resist. Kowski had told him not to go, but his desperation would outweigh his discipline. The night of the sting was cold and drizzly. The alley was slick with rain. FBI SWAT teams were hidden in unmarked vans and on nearby rooftops. Stephen and Mark sat in a surveillance van, a block away, watching the video feeds from hidden cameras and listening to the audio from the wire on Petrino. "He's here," the team leader whispered over the comms. On the monitor, Frank Miller's SUV pulled up. He got out, looking over his shoulder, his face etched with anxiety. He was no longer the arrogant, powerful cop from the courtroom. He was a cornered animal. Petrino walked up, carrying a duffel bag filled with FBI money. "You're crazy for coming here, Donnie," Miller hissed. Kowski said. "Kowski ain't the one whose pay got cut off," Petrino countered, holding out the bag. "This is it. The family says thanks and goodbye. They said to lay low for a year, maybe move down to Florida." Miller snatched the bag, unzipping it, and looking inside at the stacks of cash. A wave of relief washed over his face. This was his escape, his way out. "Did you tell anyone you were coming?" Miller asked, his paranoia kicking back in. "Nah," Petrino said, just as he'd been coached. "Just you and me, and Kowski, of course. He's the one who set it up." It was the critical line, the confirmation of the conspiracy. "Go, go, go," Stephen yelled into his mic. Floodlights instantly bathed the alley in brilliant white light. The doors of the unmarked vans flew open, and heavily armed SWAT agents swarmed in red laser dots dancing on Miller's chest. "FBI, don't move hands in the air." Frank Miller froze the duffel bag, dropping from his hand, the money spilling onto the wet pavement. His face, illuminated by the floodlights, was a mask of utter disbelief and total ruin. As agents cuffed him, Stephen Hayes allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. The net, woven with patience and precision, had been pulled tight. But there was one more fish to catch. As Miller was being read his rights, a second FBI team was 2 miles away, knocking on the door of Lieutenant Adam Kowski. His carefully constructed world of laundered money and protected corruption was about to come crashing down around him. The arrests of Officer Frank Miller and Lieutenant Adam Kowski detonated within the Baltimore Police Department like a well-placed charge, sending fractures through the blue wall of silence that had protected them for years. The initial news reports were sensational, but the reality unfolding within the sterile walls of the FBI field office was a far more methodical and devastating affair. Frank Miller, stripped of his uniform, his badge and his bravado, sat in a cold interrogation room. The man who had commanded a courtroom with sheer aggressive presence was now a slumped figure, his face ashen, his hands trembling. Through the one-way glass, Stephen Hayes watched, flanked by his partner, Mark Riley. This wasn't about gloating. It was about procedure. It was about seeing the job through to its conclusion. Yet beneath the professional calm, Stephen couldn't suppress the paternal satisfaction of knowing the man who had terrified his son was finally powerless. Miller's court-appointed lawyer advised him to stay silent, but Stephen knew that men like Miller, men whose entire identity was built on a foundation of perceived strength, didn't crumble quietly. They shattered. Mark Riley entered the room and began the slow, deliberate process of laying out the evidence. He didn't press or threaten. He simply presented the facts. First, he placed a crystal-clear 8x10 print on the table. It was the enhanced photo from Timothy's camera. The handoff. Miller flinched, as if he'd been struck again. "Your illegal meeting with Dominic Petrino," Mark said calmly. "Photographed by the very boy you arrested to get this picture." Next came the audio player. He pressed play, and the room filled with the scratchy, undeniable sound of Miller's voice from the wiretap talking to Petrino in the alley, confirming Kowski's involvement. Miller sank lower in his chair, shaking his head. Then came the final pieces: bank statements, showing the structured deposits, GPS maps with glowing red lines, tracing his secret movements, phone records from the burner phones. It was an avalanche of evidence, a meticulously constructed cage from which there was no escape. "Your entire corrupt enterprise, Frank," Mark said, leaning forward. "We have it all. Right now, you're facing the full weight of a federal conspiracy charge. You'll be the poster boy for BPD corruption. You'll do hard time, and your lieutenant will probably cut a deal to testify against you." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Or you can be the one who helps himself. You can tell us everything. You can give us Kowski and anyone else he was protecting. The choice is yours." Miller looked up, his eyes swimming with desperation and defeat. He saw his life, the house in Ruxton, the boat, his pension, his freedom, all of it gone. In that moment, the last vestiges of the arrogant street cop died, and what was left was just a terrified, broken man. He nodded slowly. "I'll talk," he whispered, his voice cracking. His confession was a deluge. He gave up Kowski without hesitation, detailing the entire money laundering scheme, the protection racket for the Rinaldi family, and most damningly, the years-long practice of burying misconduct complaints for a select group of officers. He named names. The dominoes began to fall across the city. The ensuing internal affairs investigation, overseen by the Department of Justice, was brutal and cleansing. 6 months later, the final act played out in the solemn, wood-paneled expanse of a federal courthouse. The air here was different from the chaotic misdemeanor mill. It was heavy with consequence. Timothy sat between his father and Sarah Chen, who had insisted on being there. He wore a simple suit, feeling a strange mix of anxiety and finality. He wasn't on trial, but it felt like the closing chapter of his own story. He watched as Frank Miller, thinner and greyer, was led to the defendant's podium. When the time came, Miller turned his gaze, sweeping past the prosecutors and the judge, finally landing on Timothy. His voice, when he spoke, was unrecognizably soft, stripped of its former menace. "I was arrogant," he began, his voice trembling. "I believed the badge gave me the right to be judge and jury on the street. I abused my power, and I dishonored my badge and the good officers who wear it every day. To the court, to the city, I am sorry, and to Mr. Hayes, and to his son Timothy." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "There is no excuse for what I did. That day in the courtroom, I was wrong. I was a bully, and I am truly sorry for the pain and fear I caused you." Timothy listened, his own hands clenched in his lap. He had expected to feel a surge of triumph, a wave of vindication. Instead, a complex and surprising emotion washed over him, a profound, hollow pity. The monster who had haunted his thoughts for weeks was gone. In his place was just a sad, pathetic man crushed by the weight of his own choices. It was a quiet, anticlimactic release, but it felt like closure. Stephen placed a hand on his son's back, a silent gesture of support. He watched the proceedings with a stoic face, but inside a quiet relief bloomed. He saw Timothy not shrinking from the gaze of his former tormentor, but meeting it with a steady, calm resolve. His son had endured, and he had emerged stronger. The judge delivered the sentence with grim gravity. Frank Miller was to serve 8 years in a federal penitentiary. Lieutenant Adam Kowski, who had foolishly maintained his innocence and fought the charges, was handed a sentence of 12 years. The gavel fell not with the rushed thud of a city court, but with a deliberate echoing crack that signified the end. As they exited the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, they were met by a throng of reporters. Cameras flashed and microphones were thrust forward. "Agent Hayes, what's your message to the city, Timothy? How does it feel?" Stephen instinctively moved to shield his son. But Timothy stood his ground, his shoulders squared. He looked at his father, a silent understanding passing between them. Stephen turned to the cameras, his arm resting proudly on Timothy's shoulder. "Today justice was served," Stephen said, his voice clear and steady, carrying over the clamor. "This case was never about revenge. It was about accountability. It's a reminder that no one, regardless of their position or uniform, is above the law." He looked down at Timothy, then back at the reporters. "That's all we have to say." In the weeks that followed, the noise faded and a new, peaceful rhythm settled over their lives. Stephen found Timothy one evening in his room, which was now more of a creative studio. Spread across his desk was a series of carefully curated photographs ready for mounting. They were breathtaking. The portfolio began with his earlier work, the hauntingly beautiful images of urban art and decay. But then the tone shifted. There was a stark architectural shot of the columns outside the federal courthouse titled "Pillars of Accountability." There was a candid photo of Sarah Chen in the hallway, looking exhausted but resolute. And in the very center, printed in a rich, dramatic monochrome that seemed to suck all the light from the room, was the picture, the grainy, blurry, world-changing photo from the alley. Timothy had titled it simply, "The Handoff." It was the anchor of his entire story. "This is my application portfolio," Timothy said, his voice quiet but confident, "for the Maryland Institute College of Art and a couple of schools in New York." Stephen studied the images, his heart swelling with a pride that was almost painful. Timothy had not erased his trauma. He had processed it, owned it, and transformed it into a narrative of profound power. He had used his art to reclaim his story. "There's something else," Timothy said, turning from the desk to face his father directly. His eyes were clear and full of a purpose Stephen had never seen there before. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened. Everyone had a story, the prosecutor, the police, the news. But all their stories were wrong. They said I was a punk, a vandal. The only thing that told the truth was my camera." He took a deep breath, the words coming out with newfound certainty. "I don't just want to take pretty pictures anymore, Dad. I was reading about photojournalists who go into conflict zones and forensic photographers who help solve crimes. They're using a camera to find the truth, to show people what's really happening, to give a voice to people who don't have one. Like you do, but with a lens. The words hit Stephen with the force of a physical blow. The ordeal had not broken his son. It had forged him. It had given him more than just a story for a college application. It had given him a mission. A rare, wide smile spread across Stephen's face. "I think," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's a brilliant idea, Timothy. The world needs more people who know how to look for the truth." Months later, a thick envelope with the insignia of the prestigious School of Visual Arts in New York City arrived. Timothy held it in his hands for a long moment, the weight of it feeling like the weight of his entire future. Stephen stood beside him, a silent, supportive presence. When Timothy finally opened it, his eyes scanned the page before a slow, brilliant smile lit up his face. He had been accepted on a full scholarship. The enclosed letter from the head of the photography department specifically praised his portfolio for its unflinching narrative power and raw emotional honesty. His journey, which had begun in a shadowed alley with the injustice of a wrongful arrest and the sharp sting of a slap, had not ended in bitterness or fear. It had brought him here to this moment of triumph, to a future he had forged himself from the crucible of his own ordeal. For Stephen Hayes, watching his son step confidently toward his new life, this was a form of justice more complete and satisfying than any prison sentence could ever provide. This story began with an act of violence and an abuse of power, but it didn't end there. It became a story about a father's unwavering resolve, the undeniable power of truth, and the strange, unexpected ways that karma delivers its verdict. Frank Miller's slap was meant to silence a young man, but instead it amplified his voice, giving him a story that would define his future. It reminds us that behind every headline and every statistic are real human beings, and that the fight for justice, no matter how daunting, is always worth it. It shows that true strength isn't found in a badge or a fist, but in integrity, courage, and the determination to expose the truth even when it's hidden in the shadows of an alleyway. If this story of justice and vindication resonated with you, please help us share it by hitting that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that accountability is possible. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more true stories that matter. Let us know in the comments what part of this story stood out to you the most. We read everyone. Thank you for watching.